a long
Yes.
time. And thank you also for inviting me. I'm pretty excited to kind of meet folks in your group and talk about gypsy moth. It's something that I've worked on for a long time, but I'm not supposed to call it gypsy moth anymore. So we'll talk about that along the way. So I guess I'll just start right out. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so let's see. For some reason, my computer, my PowerPoint, there we go. Okay, so this is the world distribution of Lymantria dispar. You know, it's an invasive species here, but it's an invasive species here for a long time. So I'm going to throw in a little bit of history off and on in order to help us kind of understand what's going on with Lymantria dispar in North America. But look at the native distribution all across Europe and northern temperate Asia and North Africa. There we go. So it was introduced into North America by this guy, H.N. Trouvelot, who wanted to breed a better silk moth. And so he wanted to get the gypsy moth to mate with the native silk moths. He didn't know in 1860s that you couldn't get different species to mate with each other. But so he was trying, and then he had a broken window in his house. There's a picture of his house in Medford, Massachusetts, and the gypsy moths got out. And pretty soon, in another year, they really increased quickly, and the population was, all of a sudden, it was eating all the leaves on all the trees in springtime in his house, around his house, his neighbor's house. Then he moved because it was kind of embarrassing. So he moved a little further away, and the gypsy moths had spread by then and were starting to eat all the leaves on all the trees there. Anyway, eventually he moved back to France, and he realized that entomology was not the subject for him. He became an astronomer, and these are some of his drawings of different heavenly bodies. And he actually has a name, a crater on the moon and a crater on Mars that are named after him, that are named Trouvelot. So he was more successful, right, in astronomy after he kind of blew it in entomology. Okay, so gypsy moth was introduced, and it was roaring right along. And at first, there were these attempts to eradicate them. And you can see, does this look like a health hazard? But it was also, they failed at this. At the same time, for spraying, they were spraying arsenic onto trees in order to kill the gypsy moths. It was, things were not going well. And eventually they just considered eradication, completely getting rid of them, was just impossible. And so here's a picture of egg masses. So this is what they're trying to do, is reach all the egg masses and scrape them off. Anyway, don't try it. So I'm sorry for those of you who know a lot about gypsy moth already, but I have to kind of do just a few basics about gypsy moth if I'm going to be talking about it for very long. So it's got one generation a year, and they overwinter a lot of the year. They just spend in the egg stage from about August till about May. And then they're caterpillars for 2 months. And it's during that 2 months that you are most interested in them, because they start out really small. You can see this picture of the caterpillars, and that little black line, that's the very youngest one, just hatched from an egg. And they get bigger, bigger, bigger. And then once they're the biggest, before they're going to pupate, become a pupa, then become an adult, that's when they do most of their damage. And so around here, that's in June. And I'll use the word, instead of caterpillar, I'm afraid probably part of the time I'll use the word larvae or larva. And I think I can't stop myself. That's like the technical term that we use in entomology. And then the time between two different molts, we call that an instar. So if I talk about instars, that just means a certain age of the caterpillars. So other weird gypsy moth things, which gypsy moth are strange in a number of ways, but one weird thing is that the females don't fly. I mean, that happens in some moths, but it's definitely not the main thing that happens in most moths. And the females are around kind of July and August, but the adult males do fly, but they fly during the day. Now, most moths don't fly during the day. So this is another weird thing. The picture on the right at the bottom, that's the male that's brown and the female is all white. So they look really different from each other, is where we think you get the name Lymantria dispar for disparate, that the males and females don't look alike. Okay, and just a little bit more basic information about gypsy moth, and you might know this, and I'm not a botanist, so I hope that I'm, okay on what I'm presenting here, but they're what we call polyphagous. They'll eat lots of different things, but they definitely have very preferred things. If those trees are around or shrubs, then they'll be feeding on those. If they aren't around, or if they've eaten all the leaves off of those, then they'll switch over to these intermediates, which include things like hickories and maples and some birches and spruce pines. But there are certain things that they just absolutely won't touch. And you won't even see one bite out of them, although your oak tree right next to them will be completely without leaves. So, and I put oaks in green bold letters because that's definitely kind of a major issue. Okay, so just a little bit more history and to get some perspective on what's going on. So it was 1869 that they got out of Leopold of the Truvelo house, and then they spread, kind of slowly at first as the populations grew, and then you can see 1915, 65, and as you go along, that the gypsy moth population definitely, they're pretty good at spreading, and some of that spread is from people helping them, like with emerald ash borer. And the first time that they were seen in the Ithaca area, and this was information from Dr. Frankelmont in the Department of Entomology, was 1974. Okay, so in the previous slide, as they were spreading and spreading, there were different control programs. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but there were different control programs in order to get rid of gypsy moth totally, and then to actually stop the spread. That was what some of the control programs were called, stop the spread. And you saw those maps. It was not successful. They didn't stop the spread. And so eventually they changed the name. That's the better approach, to slow the spread. And so that's what they have now. And gypsy moth is still spreading. It's an invasive species. It's still spreading. And this map shows you the edge of the spread, kind of the yellow there. The yellow and the pink is where gypsy moths actually are considered to be established. And then the green are areas where, if they have new populations that move into those green areas where they're actually using traps to detect them all the time, then they come in with control measures in order to get rid of those really young, new, small populations. So it's the Slow the Spread program, very, very successful program. But you can see it's actually covering a lot of area. You go, wow, why is it such a big deal? Well, this is why. here's the current range of gypsy moth that's actually up from that black line. And the red are all the areas that have a lot of the preferred trees for gypsy moth. So there's a lot of the United States that has preferred trees. The gypsy moth isn't there yet. And gypsy moth is gonna eventually spread there. But we, of course, would rather not. I mean, look at the Ozarks. That's going to be really something if and when it gets there. Now, I'm not going to talk about it gets sometimes introduced different places. Then there's big all-out wars to get rid of it at these tiny populations. Anyway, so there is a reason for the slow spread program. It's needed. Okay, so a little bit of ecology. So gypsy moth is what we call an outbreak insect. Now, remember I told you it's native in Europe, and everywhere that gypsy moth is, we get what we call outbreaks, which is the occurrence of really huge, with increased populations. And so here's a graph I got from some colleagues in Bulgaria. And this is just kind of normal gypsy moth activity in their oak forests that you get these outbreaks kind of in a cyclic kind of pattern. And so here's an outbreak looking on one of the ridges in Pennsylvania that is in Center County. This was just in 2007, and we call this defoliation because they've eaten most of the leaves out of a lot of the forest canopy down there. And so it's one of the ways that gypsy moth is actually quantified. The population is quantified, and it's done from the air and to quantify the defoliation. The other way to quantify the gypsy moth is to count the egg masses, and we'll talk about that too. So what about gypsy moth outbreaks in New York State? Since here we are in New York State, and so I looked for the data on this. And this is the New York State, the defoliation from 1940 till this year. And you can see that the population stayed really low. The first defoliation was actually found in 1944. And then there was this really big outbreak that was in 81, 82. As far as I know, nobody really knows the cause of this outbreak, but it was not only New York at all. It was throughout the Northeast. And then in 2021, there's this outbreak at scattered locations throughout New York State. So it's kind of been on the upswing, but the populations have been really low for like 30 years. Okay, so a little bit more history, talking about the control programs, because gypsy moth doesn't occur without people wanting to control it. And so this is the spread map that I already showed you. And in between 1950 and 1965, you can see that gypsy moth just really moved into New York, and it moved north in Maine and throughout Vermont. Anyway, it really spread a lot during that time. And while that spread was going on, that was around in the 1940s, that's when DDT was discovered. And this DDT was considered to be really terrific, and it was really good. You could kill insects with it so easily. And so with this massive spread of gypsy moth, they used DDT a lot against not only gypsy moth, a lot of different insects. And Rachel Carson, you probably know her name from Silent Spring, which was published in 1962. She actually alerted everyone that this rampant use of DDT, especially DDT, was harming other organisms in the environment. And all of a sudden, people became very aware of this, and it was definitely negative. And well, we shouldn't do that using DDT, but how are we going to control gypsy moth? And that's how we get to talking about biological control and using natural enemies was kind of the progression that, you know, a DDT, oops, that wasn't good, but we still need something. And so they started looking into biological control programs. Now that was based on, especially because this is an invasive species, is based on this thing called the enemy release hypothesis. When you move a species into a new area, the populations in the new area aren't controlled because the natural enemies regulating them in their area of origin are not present. And so this has been actually argued some, you know, since then, but this is what was driving things at this point, was this idea that if they found the natural enemies helping to control gypsy moth where it was native and introduce them, then it would help control the gypsy moth populations in North America. So how did that go? Well, they used this thing called classical biological control. So introduction of natural enemies from the area of origin, and when you do this, you're hoping that the natural enemy persists and regulates populations. Now there are definitely downsides to this too, and it's no longer being done. But for a long time, it was done. And so 55 species of natural enemies were introduced between 1905 and 1997. It's a lot. Most of them didn't get established, but they established 12 parasitoids, either small wasps or flies, that got established that kill the gypsy moth larvae, and then they develop within the gypsy moth larvae, the caterpillars. Also, they introduced one of the predatory beetles that they introduced, got established. But the control from any of these was not very good. So you can see there's a wasp that's actually laying an egg into a gypsy moth caterpillar there. And in the middle picture, these are very tiny wasps that lay their eggs in gypsy moth eggs. And over here on the right is a fly that actually lays its larvae into a gypsy moth caterpillar, and then the caterpillar dies. So, but none of them were very successful. Okay, so we would call that parasitoids or parasites and predators. They didn't really add up to much, but the pathogens have been much more effective. And the one that we knew about first was this virus that called a nucleopolyhedrovirus, and it was accidentally introduced, probably along with the parasitoids, before 1907. So a long time ago. It kills the infected larvae, and it's highly host specific. So that's good. It's not going to affect other caterpillars or any other insects. All of these natural enemies that I'm talking about only would be infecting insects. But it's density dependent, which means that it doesn't do much in a low density population. It's just effective in a high density population. And but it's slow. It requires several weeks to kill infected larvae. That's not good for gypsy moths. Then in some ways it's not that effective. So it's mass produced for control in environmentally sensitive areas. I'll talk about that in a moment, but it's really not available to the public. Over here, these little things that look like balls, that's actually this dead gypsy moth is full of those, and those go down into the soil, and that's kind of the inoculum, the overwintering inoculum. And this is kind of a hypothetical of showing a gypsy moth density and going into an outbreak, and once you have an outbreak population for a bunch of years, that's like, nobody wants that. But for a bunch of years, then you can get a high enough amount of virus, and you can have a big epidemic due to the virus. So that's the virus, and the virus got introduced in 1907 and was important for control, but it really didn't prevent a lot of damage. And so now I'm going to talk about this fungal pathogen, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to talk about it a little bit longer because this is what I've worked on for years. So it's called Entomophaga myrmiga, and it only infects the larvae, the caterpillars, and it kills them in 4 to 7 days, about twice as fast as the virus. So it's much faster than the virus. It makes 2 kinds of spores. I'll talk about that in a minute. It's really host specific. So it's mostly killing just gypsy moth, but unfortunately, we never found a viable way to mass produce it. So it was accidentally introduced from Japan, where it's native, and it was first detected in 1989. Now, remember I said there's 2 kinds of spores. Over on the left, those kind of, we call them pear-shaped spores. Those have actually, the fungus, it only makes spores after it's killed a caterpillar, and then it grows out through the skin of the caterpillar, and it makes these spores and it shoots them off, and they can be airborne. And the other kind of cadaver here is full of these kind of balls that are in the picture up in the upper right, and right here. And these are what we call resting spores. And this cadaver falls down to the ground. Those get leached into the soil, and that's the overwintering inoculum. And the fungus, also like the virus, can cause big epidemics. And these are just some pictures of lots of dead caterpillars on trees. And with the fungus, remember, with the virus, you only saw this at very high density populations. With the fungus, this can happen at both high and low density populations. Okay, and this is just a little video that was taken in my lab, looking at a gypsy moth caterpillar that was dead and killed by the fungus. And this was all night long in a humid atmosphere, and the fungus is now growing out of the caterpillar and shooting off spores all around the caterpillar. And so if this happened in nature on a tree, those would be on the tree trunk, but then some of them would end up in the wind, and we know that sometimes they can go long distances. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is a complicated slide. I just want to use this to say that there can be a number of fungal generations per season because the fungus kills the caterpillars so fast. And so you can go from a spore infecting a caterpillar, killing that caterpillar, and then the fungus makes more spores that infect another caterpillar, like 4 to 9 times during a season, and each time increasing the amount of infection if conditions are good. So this is how epidemics of this pathogen happen. Okay, so you might have seen some dead insects on trees, and it definitely could have been the fungus. We find most of the infection, so these are levels of infection, and we find most of the infection kind of later in the end of June or beginning of July. And here's just showing the instars, so we find the most infection in the later instars. And we find more infection when it's a little cooler in spring, and it's more infection when it's a little wetter in spring. But we don't have to have super wet conditions in order for the fungus to be active. So near Dryden, actually in Yellow Barn State Forest, we were sampling for a number of years, and the black line here is the gypsy moth population in 92. There was a really high density population and then it crashed. The fungus had just moved into this area. It hadn't occurred in the area before. And then from then on, the blue line is how much fungal infection, that's the bar over on the right-hand side, how much fungal infection we found in the caterpillars in the red oak plantation where we were working each season. So the fungus continued, and then our studies did not. And so, you know, the population got so low that it was really difficult to continue the studies. And so we moved to other places to do studies. And in 2009, this is a bunch of different sites. And just to show you of the caterpillars that we reared from these sites, we collected and reared which natural enemies were we finding. And the red is the fungus. And you can see that it's really overwhelmingly what was active in the gypsy moth population. A little bit the virus, some of the orange, the parasitoids, but really the dominant natural enemies, the fungus. Okay, so then let's talk about this outbreak. And so in 2020, I started hearing about that there was lots of defoliation around Canandaigua Lake, and then here's 2021. These pictures were taken in the end of June, and remember that's the big caterpillars eat the most, and so that's like in June is where you're going to see lots of this what we call defoliation. And here's a map, a New York State DEC map showing the defoliated areas. And remember I told you they use airplanes, they fly over areas and to quantify the defoliation. And so that's how they got this information. And so you can see that there were kind of scattered areas of defoliation where there were high density gypsy moth populations. In total, 678,495 acres, but kind of scattered here and there. So then a good question then is, well, what happened? How come the population been low for so long and all of a sudden it started erupting, going into outbreak? So the last outbreak in the Ithaca area was in 1992. That's 29 years ago. Now, one thing that I know from working with this fungus for so long, and remember that's the dominant natural enemy now, the fungus, if you look at, these are pictures from West Virginia National Forest, but regardless, over time, after there's been a lot of fungal infection in the population, remember those overwintering spores, that's the inoculum for the spring, and they go down and they're in the soil, and they can be in really high numbers in the soil, but some of them germinate every year or get eaten by other things. And so the number of resting spores in the soil decreases over time. Here it was decreasing over time, and then there was kind of a resurgence in gypsy moth. A lot of gypsy moth got infected, and all of a sudden you had more resting spores in the soil again. But the gypsy moth population has been low for 29 years. So I think that number of resting spores in the soil, for the most part, has really dropped. And the virus and the parasitoids also declined. So that's kind of one reason that you could have this outbreak. And then another, thinking of the fungus, also the virus, the fungus and the virus both do better under wet conditions, wet spring. And in the last several years, we had some kind of drier, and remember the most important time is in June, but in May for the younger caterpillars, June for the later ones. And so that's the green bars. You can see that in 2016 and 18 and in 2020, that it was really dry in June, and maybe the wet years in between really didn't help us bounce back enough. So the natural enemy population is probably really low, and then the weather didn't help them out. But what's going to happen in 2022? I know that you would like to know that, and I would like to know that too. But gypsy moth, you know, a lot of people have worked on it for years and years, really extensively, and we've been needing all those people to work on it because it's so unpredictable. It's really hard to know what's going to happen. Like I said, look at that giant outbreak in 1981 and 82, and no one ever figured out why it went into outbreak then. So I'm going to talk just for a couple minutes about what about 2022, and will the population, you know, continue on outbreak or kind of stay the same, or will the natural enemies catch up with it? So what about fungus activity? Remember, that's the dominant natural enemy. Well, and so from my like 20 years of data on gypsy moth, an average level of central New York rainfall, we would get good infection levels. So you just can't have a drought for the fungus to still be effective. On the other hand, I've worked in very specific areas, and that doesn't relate to everywhere, but that's my general knowledge. And so then over here on the upper right-hand side, then this is a tree from this summer, this spring, summer in June, July, and you can see all those dead caterpillars on the tree, and each one of those contains resting spores. And so that will actually rejuvenate that overwintering inoculum. And so we'll add to it that way. But there's also, remember those fungal spores I showed you that, oops, I went the wrong way. Okay, I showed you that, that little video with the spores being produced from the dead caterpillar. Well, some of those, like I said, get airborne. And you can see the map over here on the left. Here's the initial spread of the fungus. We think a lot of it was airborne. And we think that the spores in one season can travel more than 120 kilometers. So maybe some of those spores will kind of move into different areas of New York to combat different gypsy moth populations. These other things, we've just done a bunch with trying to catch spores out of the air. So that's researchers in my lab. Okay, so I'm almost done. So then what can you do? Because, you know, now it's just the waiting game, right? So you need to get ahead of it by figuring out what kind of gypsy moth population you have. And in order to do that, you have to look for egg masses. So look at all the sides of your trees and rocks and sticks. And for egg masses, we use binoculars for looking into tree canopies. And I absolutely suggest that. So they lay a lot of the eggs high up in tree canopies. If you find a large number of egg masses, then you should probably talk to the DEC or extension or arborists about different control options. I'm going to talk just about a couple of them that are more, I think, environmentally safe. So first, you know, you cannot purchase the fungus or the virus. They do mass produce the virus, but not that much, and they use it in environmentally sensitive areas. It's the feds in the state that get to use it. It's not for individuals. But there is something that the Forest Service only uses this. It doesn't use chemical insecticides anymore. It uses this bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis. But it's only effective if it's applied against small caterpillars, like the second and third instars. This is the reason you need to know about your egg masses, and if you have very many. Because if you if you kind of figure out that you have a lot of gypsy moth caterpillars and they're already big, well, there's not much you can do, and this Bacillus thuringiensis won't help you with big caterpillars. Only the small caterpillars are susceptible. So you have to plan ahead. And then, of course, the big, I mean, it's really ugly. We wait all winter long in order to get leaves on the trees, and then gypsy moth eats all the leaves in June. I mean, that's feel like you're robbed. But even worse is, are your trees going to die? But defoliated, healthy deciduous trees usually refoliate the same year. So maybe you've actually seen that. Totally defoliated evergreens like pine trees or spruce, they will die. So evergreens really can't lose all their leaves, their needles, whatever, to gypsy moth. But if you have weakened or stressed trees, severe defoliation in 1 year or repeated defoliations can kill the trees. And I show you this paper. It's kind of an older paper down below that's available online that really goes into a lot of detail about, you know, just how much you should be worried about defoliation for the trees that you have. Because it seems to me it gets very specific for certain circumstances. Hard for me to make generalities. Okay, so I hope I haven't kept you too long. I'm really sorry. I could talk about gypsy moth for days and weeks and months, so you got off easy. And so I just want to acknowledge a lot of people that, especially folks, some of these folks that gave me defoliation data that was really recent. And I just wanted to show these. There are a couple of really useful pamphlets. I don't know if you've seen these, but this forest insect and disease leaflet makes it sound like it's short, but it's like 30 pages long and provides lots of good information. And then if you find dead gypsy moths and you want to look at natural enemies, Laura Blackburn and I made a necropsy guide. And then just quickly, I wanted to say that apologize for using the words gypsy moth this whole talk. I'm not switched over yet, but the Entomological Society of America, they have a whole committee that approves common names. So everyone uses the same name and can talk to each other and understand what insect they're talking about. And Lymantria dispar, as you know, it's been gypsy moth, but the Entomological Society of America has decided that it's important to actually think about social issues also. And I guess Roma really feel that the term gypsy is derogatory. And so now they are working on a new name that is not gypsy moth, that doesn't offend anyone. And then here's a website. I think that my talk is being recorded. So here's a website you can actually go on and make suggestions for an alternate name for gypsy moth. But first, you might look at this other website that there are some criteria that they have, like they don't want you to name it after a country or, you know, anyway, they have certain criteria. So you'd want to look at that too. Okay, so I'm afraid I've kept you longer than I was supposed to. So I think that there's going to be questions now.
Thanks so much, Anne. That was great. And everyone seems to be echoing that sentiment as well in the comments that I can see. I can read through those, or why don't I entertain questions from the group first? Does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask a question have a question for Anne? David, I see your hand up.
Anne.
Hi. Oh, hi.
Hi.
It's been a long time since
Yeah, David
we were
and
in
I
the
were
same
at Voice
institute
Thompson
together.
Institute at the same time.
In looking at your map, it looks like the moths, I'll just say moths, are spreading a little south, but they're mainly spreading to the west, which is curious because the concentrations of oaks are really skyrocket as you go south, and they're not that dense as you go west. So it's curious that that's the direction that the spread would really go in.
There's been a study that done along the southern border of Virginia, where it meets North Carolina. And gypsy moth has this obligate diapause that it needs a certain number of cold days in order to come out of diapause at the right time, because these are the eggs. And because it's important that the newly hatched caterpillars have very soft, very soft new leaves that don't have all those secondary plant compounds. And so the timing is really important. And they, once they get down in further south, then they get screwed up on that diapause and they don't survive well. And so that's why we're not seeing them move more, really significantly south.
That's great information, and thanks for a great talk.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was great. Good question I had as well. Thanks, David, for posing that. Anyone else got a question they want to?
My question was in the chat, but I'll ask it now. I have a lot of egg masses, and I'm concerned about, people say scrape them off if you have a lot, and that's okay. I could do that. I know I'll miss some. I also saw you could spray with horticultural oil to smother them. Now, it seems to me that the best thing would be to scrape them off and then spray what I can't get with the horticultural oil. Is it worth doing that, or are you just saying that's kind of hopeless because you won't get most of them anyway?
Yeah, so the scraping, I actually conversed with some gypsy moth friends today, and the scraping, well, you'd probably kill some of those eggs. There's a lot of eggs, especially if you have a high density population. There's a lot of the egg masses that are high up and you won't be able to get those. And so then that's a problem. And spraying with horticultural oil, the egg masses, the egg masses have these hairs. They're covered with hairs from the female's body, and they're very hydrophobic. And that there's a lot, it's like a big lump of eggs. It's not like, flat. And so I've never heard that spraying horticultural oil worked. So I think that you just wouldn't get into those hydrophobic hairs and through them and down into, all of the eggs. It's actually one of the reasons that the egg parasitoids, those little tiny wasps that lay their eggs in the gypsy moth eggs, they haven't been that effective because the eggs are in a big clump, and the egg parasitoids can only get to the ones on the surface and not the ones down in the middle. So it's kind of frustrating because it would be nice to do something to control, get rid of them all over the winter, but I don't know. I think, many people have worked on this lots of years, and I think if it was me, I would do something with the Bacillus thuringiensis when you got to the second instars.
Other questions from the audience?
I've seen a lot of the parasitoids this year. Have you noticed that too, or is it just luck that I happen to have seen a lot?
I'm sorry, I can't. Could you speak more loudly? I can't hear you well enough.
I've
I'm
seen
sorry.
a lot of the tiny parasitoids this year. Is that just luck, or are there more of them this year?
Of the parasitoids, you know, I wasn't sampling them this year, so I can't actually say, but in my years of, you know, kind of sampling this population over and over again, I always got some parasitoids that were laying eggs, parasitizing the gypsy moth larvae, but never very many. And as for the egg parasitoids, well, there are always some of them, but just not that many. Not enough to provide control.
Yeah, I've been seeing the egg parasitoids.
Oh yeah, they're cool, huh?
Yeah.
They're neat.
Yeah.
And then there was the one really bad parasitoid that got introduced called Compsylura, and it attacks silk moths.
Oh,
And this was in 1907, you know, and they were freaking out because all of their fruit trees were getting all the leaves eaten in springtime, and they were, you know, they didn't care that Compsylura was not specific, but was a generalist. And then it got established really well, really easily, and because it could use lots of different caterpillars in the forest. And so it's actually turned into a really good example of why classical biocontrol has to be very specific. And that's what it is now, but it certainly was not then.
And that reaches into, I'm sorry, hi, Kelly. That reaches into a question I put into the comments was with the classical control. And there were several, would you say 55 different species that were brought in? How many of those have been followed that have become, I guess, invasive species on their own, or did they just die out?
Oh, they all died. They died out, except for the 12 species that I mentioned. All the other ones just died out. They didn't make it. So, in fact, I've taught classes on invasive species, and the number isn't perfect, but it's definitely thought that out of every 100 invasive species that get introduced, only 10 of them survive at all. So that's what happened with those parasitoids. Most of them, just something was wrong in the environment or whatever, and they didn't survive. Of the 12 that did survive, none of them are, you don't see very many of them being abundant ever, because they just weren't very successful. Compsylura, even Compsylura, when I've sampled gypsy moth populations, I barely see Compsylura. The fungus outcompetes Compsylura. Compsylura takes 2 weeks in order to kill a caterpillar, and the fungus takes 4 to 7 days. So if the fungus gets there first, Compsylura dies.
But that is within
why.
your group that you're looking at. Is that within other entomological groups? Like you're looking at particularly the gypsy moth caterpillars? Are other groups affected more by them?
Of the ones that they introduced, this 12, it's really just Compsylura that has a broad host range. And the other ones are, I think it's more common for these parasitoids, these wasps and flies, to be pretty specific, host specific, and being generalists aren't as common. And so really that one, this fly, the Compsylura, that's the only one that has been at issue.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. This has been a great talk. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.
and there are several questions about using BT. Some concern about how it will kill other beneficial caterpillars. But some people also want to know when is the best time to apply it.
Okay, so I'll do the beneficial caterpillars one first.
Mhm.
And yes, it will kill other caterpillars. But I think that, well, studies that have been done show that if you knock back the gypsy moth outbreak, you kill the gypsy moths, then in 1 year or 2 years, then your native populations will increase again. So there's literature about this, that people actually looking at, you know, the non-targets, we call them non-target species, and what's the impact on the non-targets, and they will actually rebound. Now, the other thing I wanted to say along these lines is I've been in a lot of gypsy moth outbreaks, and it's like walking in the moon, you know. If there's, I wonder if you've been, did you go to a totally defoliated area? And the forest that used to be shaded and cool is now blazing sunshine, and all of the things that the plants that used to grow in the lower canopy and on the ground, they're not surviving very well because they're getting blasted by the sun. So the environment, if you don't control a gypsy moth population, the environment for all those other caterpillars, you know, how are they going to survive anyway? You know, there are other host plants that they would be eating right there in those areas with the outbreak. You know, I mean, they've got, well, they could get killed by BT, or they could get killed by, you know, not having good conditions for living. So I guess I personally would err on the side of using BT, especially if it's going to knock back your population, and then, you know, then you won't have to deal with them, and then your forest can start recovering. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. The other question is when to spray. Well, that's actually really tricky. And so I think you'd want to, if you're just spraying a couple trees, and I would spray, I would do this when it's the second instars, and that's different every year, slightly different. And you also have to be careful and not spray and get it all washed off immediately. And so I guess you'd want to, if you had just a few trees, then an arborist could spray it. But if you have like a really big area, then they spray from airplanes. And I know in places in Pennsylvania, the state sprays, and they spray big acreages. And, you know, I guess you just have to kind of see what the population looks like in order to figure out how much of a problem it is. I hope that answers your question.
Let's see, there's a new message that says, Pat Curran wants to know if how the larvae disperse. Do they blow around on a strand of silk?
Yeah, very good. Yes, that is, and that's another unusual thing about gypsy moth. After they hatch from an egg, then they will climb up. The caterpillar climbs up the tree trunk and then blows on a strand of silk. Some of them can go blowing on the wind for several kilometers. The vast majority of them land pretty close to where they started. And so it does spread the population. In fact, it spreads the population because, you know, remember, the females don't fly. And so this is the main way that gypsy moth spreads on its own. The males can fly, but the females that are the egg layers can't fly. And so it's really the first instars that have this dispersal behavior we call ballooning. Those are the dispersers.
Very colorful term. Ann Caulfield, and Ann had asked a question about when was the best time to apply the BT, and she also asks when would we see the second instar?
Well, you know what I do? What I did, remember I was sampling them every year for like more than 20 years. And I would take an egg mass. I just use a knife and scrape it off a tree and put it in a Ziploc bag and tack it outside my kitchen window. And every day, kind of in the end of April, beginning of May, I would look at the developing the eggs to see if the caterpillars had started to come out. And that tells you when eggs have started hatching. That doesn't tell you when you're at the second instar. And they'll starve in your Ziploc bag, so it doesn't really tell you. But in a week or two is when you're going to have the second instars. Then you could, yeah, but it's much easier with the egg masses instead of, you know, having to go walk out around and find an egg mass on a tree. Just kind of make that so it's easier. But second instars are gonna be about a couple of a week or 2 weeks after egg hatch. Usually, it depends a little bit on, of course, whether there's a cold snap. So looking at the trees, and there are also online, there are resources that show you how big second instars are. They're not very much bigger than the first instars. And there's no characteristic, beautiful patterns that help you out. They are just kind of black at that stage.
Thanks, Ann. A couple of questions about the fungus. I'm trying to find the first one, but well, here's one that Kelly Sams had asked. If we find dead caterpillars next year, should we leave them to spread the spores? I presume of the fungus. And someone else has just asked. Oh.
So yeah, that is what I would do. I would leave them to get the fungus well established at your, you know, where you are. Yeah.
Bruce Gilman asks, where'd it go? Can the fungus only infect living larvae, or do they also infect recently killed larvae?
Oh, only living larvae. It's an obligate pathogen. It has to have a living larva in order to grow.
Okay. Let's see. We have, here's an interesting question. Carol Eichler asks, are there any herbaceous plants that the larvae eat?
Herbaceous plants. You know,
non-woody plants, yeah.
Yeah. When larvae are starving, they've eaten all the leaves or the majority of the leaves off your oak tree. Then they go on walkabout, and you know they'll kind of start wandering around, and then you might see them actually take some nibbles out of other things because they're starving. It's usually that happens when there's, of course, a really high density population, and so you might see a little damage at that point if you have a really high density population. But for the most part, herbaceous plants, no. It's usually trees, but you know, one thing that I've always been really interested in is witch hazel, which is a shrub. And if there's witch hazel and there's a gypsy moth population, they are definitely feeding on that. They really like that. It might be not as good as oaks, but it's well up there in the favorites list. So there are some shrubs, but
this is Pat Curran. They didn't eat any of the non-native hybrid witch hazels that I grow this summer.
Okay.
But I did find a lot of very large caterpillars beneath the totally defoliated crabapple tree in the top of the aster. I was chopping the aster back a little bit to slow down the height that it would get to. And I stumbled into, dozens of caterpillars in the top 8 inches of the aster, many of which were already starting to pupate.
Wow.
So
Wow.
it made it really easy to get them out of there.
Oh, yeah. Huh, cool. I've not seen that. That's really interesting. Yeah. And the witch hazels that I'm talking about are just the native ones in the forest floor, that, the native shrubs.
I really liked your
that's
list
interesting.
of trees that were not bothered, and it was very clear that we had an oak and a maple that were being eaten, and right next to a tulip tree with not one single bite.
Oh,
and
yeah.
then a few more feet down, the catalpa tree, not a single bite out of the leaves.
Yeah. 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 They really, there's some things they just absolutely won't touch them. So.
And then we also found them on the white
starving.
fir. We found quite a few on some young white firs that are about 4 feet tall. And I'm glad that somebody had called Growline and said that the caterpillars were eating their spruce tree. So that made me go across the stream and check out the young evergreen seedlings that we